I've got you here today in the SSW chapel because you are luckily in town, and I thought I'd grab you for an interview while you're here.
Happy to chat with you. I figured we'd do space stuff, but I think you want to talk about work.
It was tempting. It was very tempting. Now, but this time, what I'd like to sort of scrape your brain on, if I can, because it's a topic that's bugging me at the moment, is app modernization.
Yes.
Because to give you a little bit of context, I'm a product owner for our invoicing software here called TimePro.
Right.
And I have all these ideas for new features that I always want to do, but the developers are always telling me there's too much technical debt, and we need to get rid of AngularJS, and we need to move to .NET Core, and that is such a huge ongoing chunk of work that I never get my features across the line.
Well, and always my question when you talk about modernization like that, or replacement of old libraries, is like, what's the benefit? You know, where does that lie? Like, yeah, AngularJS is a few years old, and the migration path off of it up to quote unquote modern Angular is not a trivial piece of effort either. But what's broken? That means we have to do that. Like, and I'm not saying that there isn't something. I'm saying like, it's not, you don't get to just say that to me. You have to show me the cost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the interesting aspects of technical debt from a product owner perspective is that it does slow down the rate of features. Right? When you have those other so many different frameworks involved in a given project, it's like, well, to implement this feature, we have to work in all these different places. It's going to take longer to build the feature. And so now I have to do this math of, well, so how much time does it take to retire that library? And how much time will we get back in feature construction once we do? And of course, sooner is always better, right? Because the more stuff we build dependent on the old library, the harder it's going to be to remove it later.
100%, yeah.
But that's a curve, right? Like there's a set of projections there about the cost of removing that thing versus the cost of leaving it in play. Like he sort of says, okay, at this point it makes sense or it doesn't make sense.
For us, we are building this thing and rebuilding this thing. It feels like a rebuild. Mm-hmm. With the lovely new modern app shiny thing that the developers like working on. It's easy to find staff to work on. They don't bang their head against the wall when they want to work on it. When they're told they're on the bench and they need to work on this.
Right.
So there's a lovely shiny light at the end of this tunnel. But it brought me to a broader topic, which is app modernization in general. When you build your own app instead of doing a software as a service, paying a license, you spend an upfront cost to build the thing, and then are you then sort of in for a lifetime of rebuilding that thing over and over and over again?
Only if the old frameworks cost you something in features in some meaningful way, right? I think that when you talk about typical app modernization today, we happen to be in the heterogeneous client cloud modernization cycle, where clearly we are dealing with customers that have phones and tablets and PCs, all of which have slightly different client needs, and we are moving more and more workloads onto the cloud, and we know that just shifting VMs to the cloud is a very expensive way to go. So it's like, can we get into that services layer of the cloud to really get benefit from it? And both of those pieces have been going on long enough now that I would argue we're at the height of that right now, where a significant number of customers are now, we're getting to the point where it's no longer just that's a leading edge cool thing to do and it'll give us an advantage to, if we don't get this done soon, our business performance is going to be impaired by not having it. So that's an interesting transition period, but it is a transition period. You know, gradually, new greenfield stuff is all coming in prepared to work with multiple clients, prepared to operate in the cloud. So it's just what apps need to be modernized and how they want to be modernized. I'm fascinated by the new tools emerging to allow us to create those kinds of modern experiences without rewriting code. Some of the more app virtualization tools and virtual desktop technologies, all of which got accelerated because of the pandemic. Because you had these old chunks of software that really only worked inside of the company perimeter, and now that people continue to work from home, like, how are we gonna solve this? And so they're shipping them up into like Azure Virtual Desktop and saying, it's still a terrible app that's really client server and has to run in a small camp, but that small client's now in the cloud, and you get access to that VM through your Azure credentials.
So we as a software consultancy have been incredibly busy ever since COVID hit.
Without a doubt, yeah.
And I think that's a huge part of it, is people suddenly shifting their work environment and not just suddenly needing a remote desktop to work from home, but actually re-engineering and re-architecting the whole ecosystem.
I mean, and I think the broader story there is getting away from perimeter security into zero trust security, which is such a fundamental thing. Like, so why is so much stuff being affected by this migration to the cloud and this new workspace? It's really because we've fundamentally changed the security perimeter. How we identify stuff and the relationships between software has changed. And that is impactful all up and down the stack, right? We in the panic that was early 2020, we did a lot of VPN workarounds and so forth. Like, you just needed to make stuff work. But as you're hitting the limits and all of that, you're trying to do a better job of how does this software become great, you do have that sort of reassessment of, are we better off rewriting this, in a Power Apps approach, right? Which is natively cloud and natively multi-client. Or can we put it in a can because so few people need to use it? Like, I'm not going to put a lot of energy into that until we can retire that piece of software out. Like, I think there's a lot of work, look across the spectrum, especially of internal applications, and say, like, what do we really need to do here? What's short-lived, what's long-lived, and what do we want to spend money on?
You just brought something up there which has made me think, Power Apps.
Yeah.
So Power Apps sits somewhere between software as a service and custom code.
Totally.
Right? If you are building a really great model-driven Power App that does exactly what you want, so it's still very custom to your business. Mm-hmm. Are you minimizing your future modernization build by the fact that Power Apps behind the scenes is going to keep getting better and better?
I think you're taking certain pieces off the table, like your ability to utilize those new platform pieces are just going to come for free. It's a limited client, so while it is really great at that phone, tablet, PC story, it's a forms over data tool. So it's a struggle to do much more with that, although in the recent incarnations, and I've just done shows around this, where you now can use your regular developers to build client-side components that you can add into the Power Platform space. So those domain experts that are building those new clients have tooling specific to your workspace. Like, I can envision now, and I don't think we're there yet, where a company built with working on their internal apps would build a set of tools for every Power Platform developer to use that would give a common look and feel, that would sort of encapsulate all of that. And then you're still, in the end, it's still logic apps under the hood, right? You can build your custom components and they can call to them. So, Microsoft's already starting to spin this terminology, but I'm seeing real field cases where regular development and the Power Platform experts, these domain experts, like, they remind me of developers from the 90s that had another profession and they picked up a VB or an Access to automate pieces of it, and then it became their job. And Power Platform seems to be playing that very same role. And so it's easy to fall into a game where it's like they're not real developers, but like, look, under the hood, in the end, they're spitting out code. And with the current set of tooling, we can now push that code to GitHub and go through a normal CI/CD pipeline and start to build some better tests around it and add our own code to it. It's just a client coding solution for forms over data. Like, why would you be unhappy with that?
Yeah.
And it's not like any of us were getting to the bottom of our to-do list, right? Like, you've got features you want to get built, right? One way or the other. Like, I wonder how many of those you might be able to pick up if the invoicing app was actually a Power Platform app and you could just prototype it yourself.
Yeah, well, we're living in a big developer shortage at the moment.
For sure. And by the way, and always have, right? The number of job opportunities has always outpaced our ability to build new developers. I would argue it's getting worse because the demand for development is growing so much more rapidly. And even though the rate of training has gone up dramatically and the resources have gone up dramatically, it can't keep up. But this, like, 20%, now closer to 30% unfilled jobs in development, it's never been lower, right? It's just a little more exacerbated than before because the space is getting so large.
But things like the Power Platform, so for instance, I'm not a developer, but I have a little training, and Power BI has let me do my own BI solutions and my own reporting, and Power Apps, same deal. You can open up development, what was officially kind of development work now, to a wider range of workers now.
And within a certain set of guidelines, right? Certain classes of work will fall nicely into this thing, so great to take that off the table and those limited dev resources don't have to worry about that. The question is it a good tool where when you hit the limits of that tool, we're not stuck? We're not at that 80% case now we have to rebuild the 80% to get the next 20. And for the most part, I'm seeing, although it wasn't like this at first, like Power Platform is clearly maturing into when you hit that 80% case, you need that last 20. We can incorporate dev resources and use what you've already got.
Yeah, it's just not a rewrite.
Yeah, it's not, don't start over, you're not in a trap. And that more and more that seems to be apparent. But again, it's like there was always too much work. Anything we can do to bring new ones in. And plus to sort of recognize this is the rekindling of an old path to growing new developers, right? That wave of rad tools that we got in the mid-90s, the VBs and so forth, created the new generation developers. Right? They became .NET developers later, many of them did. And so it's interesting to think in that context, to say 5 years down the path, those folks that got enamored of the Power Platform development, that really came in as a domain expert. I know my business space really well and I'm trying to put automation into it. And this speaks to me, like I've got a feel for this. And now I start interacting with the IT team about security and access to data and so forth. And I work with the dev team and make sure I learn those fundamentals about source code management and testing and deployment strategies. And bit by bit, I grow myself a new developer because we can't hire enough of them. Maybe we need to make some.
Yeah, so people who already know your business and then they learn the tools.
And are excited.
Yeah.
Right? Like enjoying those tools and can take work off the table that's not popular with developers anyway. Cross-platform client development is hard work. And form server data is pretty routine. And so the fact that that kind of work, which is hugely valuable and represents a big chunk of the work, can be taken on by a new tool with a group of people that are having a good time doing it, like give me more of that. That's a good day.
So you said that the main drive for app modernization is moving to the cloud and the fact that people are on different form factors.
Diversity, yeah.
So they're on mobile phones, tablets, and PCs. And you think we're around the peak of the amount of work people are throwing at this to get to there?
Yeah, just because obviously the pandemic accelerated a bunch of those forces, but it also made it abundantly clear that if you're not taking advantage of this, you're spending more and getting less.
Yeah.
And so more and more we're seeing that kind of case study where it's like, hey, when you do a good job working in the cloud, you become that kind of cloud native app, it costs you less and it's far more responsive to your business needs. And when you realize that client diversity is important and your programming practice tends to be done by people working on PC for people on the PC, like that was fine, but the majority of your customers, especially if it's public facing, are on phones.
Yeah.
And you're not building
for B2C, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's just sort of been the reality, right? And so you're not good at that. Like that's hard work. And so whatever we can do to take those things off the table is hugely valuable. But it's becoming table stakes, right? It's becoming normal now that you expect it to work on all devices.
Right. So over time then, eventually everyone will be on the cloud and everyone will have apps that work.
Yeah, the majority. There's always exception cases, right? We're never going to get rid of all of the equipment in our offices, right? It's just a question of what needs to be here. But the fact that we're also just not using offices as much, that there is this push for work from home more and more, then that's actually a routine part, or it's 4 days out, 1 day in. Like all of those kinds of models speaks to this ubiquitous programming or ubiquitous operations model where it doesn't matter where I am or what device I'm using, it should just work. And so the computer at the office is a different machine from the computer at home. I'm not taking it back and forth. And then maybe I also use a laptop once in a while. And occasionally I have to be able to make decisions from the phone. And so when a normal information worker is just naturally going to use multiple devices, how portable is identity? How clear are those workflows in those different form factors? You're not asking them to learn any one of them. You're asking for them to be comfortable in all of them.
Yeah. I think another big, just in our space as Microsoft Stack developers, a big shift, seismic shift that happened was the move from .NET Standard to .NET Core.
Yeah.
And then now, in order to take advantage of that and to move forward, you've got to basically redevelop your applications.
Yeah, depending on how you built them in the first place, right? And especially when you're dealing with stuff from standard, from 4.8, that didn't make it across. And the big kahuna in the room is web forms, right? And we're seeing a wave towards Blazor, largely because Blazor has the same feel as web form development, right? We have component libraries, the ecosystem's gotten big around it, you recognize the programming model, it's a language you already love, like there's lots of pieces about it. And Blazor's still got its rough edges, like it's growing up a bit, and you do have to learn some new practices, but works better on mobile, like it doesn't make building a responsive web app easy automatically, but at least has more options than web forms ever did.
Yeah, and it's reusable in Maui.
Yeah, but if I was in your shoes as a product owner, as you're going down this list of apps and saying, are we going to make the migration to core, or should we be looking at Power App? Like, should we be looking, because they're not small changes, one way or the other, but what's the deliverable on this? How many people are using it? How important is the client diversity? How important is remote access? What's our security risk as we get out of the perimeter and get into more zero trust? Like, where are those problems going to be hard? And then when you start adding that up, you're suddenly, maybe this is better served that way. I would be very tempted if I had a couple of skilled Power App folks floating around to say, every time we go at an app for a little while, I'm going to commit 2 hours to one of these folks prototyping some screens, because they can do a lot in a very little time, and say, like, how far down the path are we here, and say, should we just keep re-engineering? It's an acknowledgement that the jump from standard, from 4.8 to whatever version of core, and probably it's 6. If you don't have dependencies on those libraries that weren't migrating, the web forms and the WCFs and so forth, then it's not as hard a jump. You'd probably be a little better off, and you might find some nice things. If you're still using web forms, or you're still using WinForms, and I got nothing bad to say about GR, because if the bulk of your users are living in Windows, WinForms is wildly productive, but the WinForms in core is different, right? That SDK changed. It became good at high resolution screens, and that's awesome, but you've got to go look at every screen. You gotta. But that's less cost than rebuilding all those screens, no matter what technology you're talking about.
Yeah. So you were talking about the people who move quickly, and then the people who go a little slower after that, and then eventually people who feel like they're being left behind and they have to move.
And I was referencing a classic book called Crossing the Chasm, which was really an acknowledgement of marketplace when it comes to technology, that there's always a few folks that love being your beta testers, that sub 1%. And part of that story is like, don't get too enamored of these folks, because your next group is about a 10% of the market opportunity, and that's the forward-thinking, leading-edge personalities that are going to tolerate your rough edges. They're probably not going to be beta testers. They're still going to work on their own stuff, but they're more tolerant. And then following that is that third, the 30-something%, which are also quite progressive, but they want clear paths of migration. They want things to be more reliable.
Is that your standard early adopters?
But they're also pulling the product out of you. They want in, right? And the real chasm is after that. You've got less than half the market at that point, and what comes after that. And I brought that up mostly because cloud's at that point where we're getting to the end of that third, and we're now starting to talk about that trailing third. And you see the messaging shifting. The way we talk about cloud is different, that these are now fundamental to being productive in business. That your argument has to be, when you talk to management or talk to your CIO, it's like, are we really going to spend the capital expenditure for a new set of servers every 5 years now, when we look at the operating costs of how this app would run in the cloud? So, I spent enough time in the IT land with Run As that we're very aware of those every 5 years or every 4 years, depending on your organization, buying new hardware, renewing contracts in data centers and so forth against the cost of cloud. And each time those things are coming up, you got to have that sit down and talk through it. And you would hope that app devs are at the room, because they're also saying, well, what's the cost of moving that app? Lift and shift to VMs doesn't always go that well, and it's expensive, right? And you're really getting the worst of cloud at that point. It is the modernization that ultimately reduced the cost per app and gives you a lot of the value that wanted to do that in the first place.
Makes it run more efficiently on cloud.
Absolutely, and are tolerant of again, the pandemic brought a bunch of new things to the table. A lot of us were ignoring remote work and forcing people to be in the perimeter. You're either in the office and inside the perimeter, or you were VPNing it. That's how you did things. But you really want to work in the cloud, you're running that zero trust model where you're always authenticating. And software doesn't respond well to that if it isn't built for that.
And that opens up more people probably to work on mobile devices as well.
Yeah, if you can build the right workflows for it, right? I think that's a very broad conversation that goes back to when tablets really established themselves in the 2010s. And the best descriptions I've ever heard of that problem space is what happens when you can bring the computing device to the work rather than bring the work to the computing device. As long as it was a machine on a desk, the work had to come to you, right? It showed up in your inbox. It was paper or whatever it may be. But as soon as you talk about phones and tablets, like devices that can be brought to the work, how do we modify the workflow so that when you go to the work, you're collecting new information, right? You have a deeper understanding of the work problem there, and you can do things differently. And that's a harder problem, but hugely valuable. Like when you see the wins, when technology is used well, using those kinds of form factors, it's because they took advantage of the camera and the locality and and gesture controls and all of those sorts of things to create a different experience for the work.
Which takes me to the last part of the sort of, well, the next part of the modernization potential tsunami that may come in the future, which is when we move completely off screens and onto augmented reality.
Well, to me, it's the only thing that can replace the phone. Like the phone is now the dominant computing device, right? It's the primary computing device for the average human. The biggest thing that the smartphone has done in the past 15 years or so, since the iPhone really came out and became the de facto consumer device, although it took a few years to do that, is that pretty much every adult human in the world now uses one. And we now come to it, every bar argument's been ruined by Google, right? You can't argue in a bar about something. Somebody's invariably going to look it up, and now you actually have the answer, and where's the fun in that? But also,
you got to go camping where there's no receptions.
And a Ugandan farmer who doesn't have power to the mains, but he does have a cell phone that charges off solar, and he does have that, is still able to get his weather information, so he's planting at the right time. Like, we have brought this power around the world. You can expect to be able to communicate with anyone anytime and have access to information. We can talk about quality of information. That's a separate problem, right? So what in the world could possibly disrupt that? And the reason I pointed out augmented reality is it's everything the phone can do and more, right? Certainly all of the basic phone services that we now count on, its ability to communicate, to access information, to help us navigate. In many ways, the goggles can do that better, right? You got to think about a navigation, walking around a city where you're literally, what you're looking at is being highlighted and you can move properly. But now we think about what the workflows look like. And we were just talking about the challenges of building good workflows for mobile devices. Building good workflows for augmented reality are very challenging. And right now, we are seeing commercial implementations of devices like HoloLens, but there's a consistent pattern to them. They tend to be very high-priced projects, multi-million-dollar projects, because the headsets are expensive and operating them is expensive. And so, to me, as an old guy who's done this for a while, it reminds me of what the experience was like with RIM and the BlackBerry in the late 90s. That's when first time we got email on phone. It was only for big enterprises because you had to run BlackBerry Enterprise on your own exchange infrastructure to be able to introduce these very expensive phones, typically for your executives, although they became broader reaching. But 10 years before the iPhone, we had that. And they were so compelling. Like, you go back and watch episodes of The West Wing. They had those phones and they were always smitten with them. They called them crackberries for a reason. But that idea of an expensive infrastructure with expensive devices for a particular purpose, it's exactly where augmented reality is right now. So now you recognize that history doesn't repeat itself, it just rhymes. So what's the rhyme? Right? It's that the infrastructure gets simpler and cheaper, the device gets less expensive, but you get that compelling experience. Like, why did the iPhone win? Right? Why did it revolutionize smartphones for regular consumers? Well, they went to a common form factor, the slab of black glass. Before that, phones were more interesting. But the early designs of the iPhone, which I thought was really compelling because it's gone away now, was the skeuomorphic design. Right? That idea that we created natural textures on the screen that people could relate to, that your books look like they were on a bookshelf, that you had the effect of leather and so forth. I mean, it seems absurd today, but that's because the consumer has changed and wants something more efficient. But in those early days, when this was unfamiliar to the majority of people, that design helped us along. Now, it didn't help you and I. We're geeks. We didn't need it in the first place, but it helped the consumer. And this is where augmented reality hasn't solved that problem yet. Like, these are the pieces that need to be solved. The question is, where does 3D create an experience that's useful for business? Right? We can see it in the high-cost verticals, in the maintenance of technology, and in these complex interactions, yes. Right? Modeling of new technology, that's fine. I'm looking for stuff like ERP, right? Like inventory management, and being able to understand a business flow in a much deeper way. Like, can we represent that more effectively? And can we interact in a meaningful way? Can I get to better decisions in less time and communicate those decisions more effectively? I'm not saying I know the answer to that, but I know the shape of those things, and AR has those pieces. And that's going to be very disruptive for development. Like, when I asked to talk about like the next 10 years, it's like, I'm not even gonna say it's a black swan event, like we don't see it coming, because we do see it coming, but we don't know how we get there just yet, right? We are holding a BlackBerry hand in 1998 and trying to guess what the iPhone looks like in 2007. You're going to be wrong, but you can guess there will be one.
I feel like the biggest wins are going to come from real-time intervention. So if you are doing real work, say you're a surgeon,
sure,
and you're working on a person, and you're wearing an AR interface, and it tells, it's got an AI behind it that has full access to all of human knowledge about, the heart or whatever.
Right.
And then something weird happens, and some image recognition comes up and says, "Hey, did you notice this? That's not normal. You should look at that."
And you bring up a great point, Ulysses, which is also all of the new AI technologies, all the image recognition technologies and machine learning models that we're now having emerging, just being present. The fact that any video that we're looking at is actually going to have this analysis going on to it and catching those things as necessary, I think that's really powerful, and we still don't grasp all of that potential. And it's part of how I think we're going to address the UX problem with augmented reality is the machine's going to get really good at reading your face and where you look and how you react, even possibly your body language, enough to know what's impacting you and what isn't. The biggest thing, I think, in consumer AR is that virtual agent we always wished we had, right? We wanted the phone to do that, but the phone's not good at it because it's often in your pocket when it needed to actually be out in the world. So imagine us negotiating a contract wearing AR glasses so that we literally have a detailed record of us doing that negotiation and the handshake. And that's interesting.
The new terms and conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. But with all of it captured. Well, all of it honest, effectively. This is what actually happened. But we're within a decade of that. We see all the pieces. Moore's law continues long enough that we should be able to densify the technology enough to get it be a little lighter and smaller and more efficient.
Apple glasses, maybe?
Less costly. Traditionally, there's been some mock-ups of what Apple's doing. In some case that Apple's working, but traditionally, disruptive products don't come from incumbents. AR might be the exception simply because the cost of the implementation is so very high.
Google tried it with Google Glass.
Yes, and I always applaud the experimenters to take it out for a spin. But when it wasn't good enough, we did make fun of it, right? And the product had to go away. Once upon a time, Apple made the Newton, right, in the 1990s as a personal productivity device, and they sold about 50,000 of them and quietly killed it after 3 years. And 10 years further on, made the iPhone.
Just trying to work out whether the market's ready for it, or the technology's ready for it.
Yeah, is the technology good enough? Is the experience compelling enough to overwhelm all of the other issues like cost and appearance and interactivity and so forth? The iPhone, I don't think we knew it when we made it, but we learned shortly after that the iPhone was good enough.
Yeah, so I suppose that'll be less of when we do completely change form factors to something like AR, it's not going to be so much an app modernization as it will be rethinking the whole business process of how you deal with a situation and then creating something for the AR space.
Well, and I wonder if we won't get more of a blending anyway. I mean, lots of folks are still struggling to make their apps work well on phones anyway, right? And we keep presuming that that the devices we build stuff on are the devices people are going to use on it. We just tend to be more and more wrong about that. And we're still overcoming those issues. Is there going to be a better blending and intersection on that? Probably. I think one of the things that's going to be a challenge for AR is you can't make the interface so different that people don't know how to use it and nobody knows how to code for it either. So maybe we will come up with a better pointing solution, a better keyboard solution that keeps the lines a little closer together so it's less of a leap than it is right now. We just haven't got it yet, but working on it.
And I suppose for business apps, you might still have the same back end and just a new front end, just an AR interface.
It is just another UX, isn't it? Ultimately, right? In the end, knowing where stuff is stored in a warehouse, still, it's a problem we currently tackle with RFID chips and handhelds, and we could be turning that into a goggle experience because it's faster, right? The bottom line is those technologies tend to take off where the cost of them is overwhelmed by the productivity boost. And at the consumer level, it's not there yet, but it is certainly in certain verticals, and those things will continue to expand.
I'd love to say that will be the end of app modernization, that will finally land at the final version, but sooner enough it'll be brain-machine interfaces, and then we'll just be...
There is no final version. There's always continued modernization, and apps only get old when we don't need them anymore. Right? When the work they need to do becomes less and less relevant, gets shrunk down. We start rethinking workflows and we can retire software. That's not a bad thing either. Retiring software should be a party. It's we got so good at solving this particular problem, we no longer have that dependency. That's not a bad solve either.
Richard, thank you so much for coming and talking to us today.
My pleasure, friend.
Really, really useful. It's always great having you here. Enjoy your stay in Australia.
Yeah, I've got a little bit of time here now to head up to the coast for a bit, and then I'm gonna skip over to New Zealand and see the family. But it's great to get back here after 3 years away.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much.
You bet.